ladies and gentlemen, I just found this incredible game that I just had to share with you in the Scandinavian defense. So, this game was played between Peter Svidler against Svidler-Rapport in the St. Louis Rapid Blitz tournament of 2021. And what I love about this game is that it shows very clearly how, if you understand the Scandinavian defense, which we have here with Knight C3 and Queen A5, that you can very often outplay even quite strong players in this opening, as in many cases they're just not well prepared for it, as we will see in this game. Before I will go into it, if you are, let's say, a not so experienced player playing as below 1600, you will often face the move E5, which the opening books often kind of neglect. But it's because you go C5, and if you're able to get, like, let's say, Knight F3, Knight C6, Bishop G4, E6, well, you just get this much improved version of a French defense, right? Where your bishop is outside the pawn chain, and, you can see that White has a very difficult time keeping his pawn safe in this example. Of course, White could play a little bit differently, but the general idea is the same, right? Get a bishop outside the pawn chain and play an improved French. So let's now focus on the way the game played out with Knight C3. And there are other moves to the queen, but I like A5 because then when White plays D4 in this position, you're pinning the knight, and that can sometimes reduce White's options a little bit. Now, you do have to be a little bit careful that the queen doesn't get trapped somehow. For example, Bishop D2 is a slightly tricky move, but as I show in my course, Play the Strongest Scandinavian, you can go Bishop to G4, and it's a pretty good reply, by the way, if they don't play Knight F3 in one move. If F3, Bishop D7, it might look a little bit weird to play like this, but the point is that, well, you are making sure that you not running into any Knight F3, Knight E5 ideas. If Bishop C4, you can play Queen B6, hitting the pawns, and Knight E2, E6. And okay, position is slightly better for White, but you're quite solid. You can prepare some ideas such as, for example, A6, Knight C6. The idea of A6, by the way, is so your queen doesn't get trapped with Knight A4. You can go Bishop E7, castle short, and I mean, your position is quite solid. So, when you were playing the Scandinavian, we're not really playing it to equalize, but we're trying to get an interesting, fresh position where we can set some different problems to the opponent and potentially outplay him in the middle game, saying that we understand the positions a lot better than them due to our greater experience and our greater familiarity with the positions. Yes or yes. So if you do want to check out my course Play Strongest Scandinavian, I've put the link in the description below. So yeah, continuing on though with how the game played out, of course the main line is the move Knight to F3, and here is where I recommend a little twist that you might not be familiar with unless you're already quite a strong player. Admittedly, it was already 2014 when I first learned of this idea from Australian Grandmaster David Smurden, who shared this idea with me and the rest of the Australian Olympiad team. And before I reveal what this key move is, do remember to smash that like button and subscribe, because hitting that red subscribe button is the easiest way to improve your chess. So the move here is not Bishop to G4. If you're wondering why we don't play this here, it's because when the knights are on F3, H3 is quite annoying, and if you try to keep the pin, they go G4, and they just get this very strong attack with Bishop G2, H4, H5, and basically you're losing here as Black if White knows what he's doing. Also, Knight C4 hitting the queen is annoying in some lines. So Bishop G4 is not the right square for the bishop. A move like C6 is just a little bit passive. Okay, it does mean that you're able to, for example, get your queen out of the way of a discovered attack. But it's still not that great. Like after Knight D5, this line is kind of well known to be a lot better for White. Because either you take with a pawn and your pawn structure is just very weak, or you take with a queen and you keep a healthy pawn structure, but then Queen E2 and you're behind in development. D5 is opening up the center next move, and it's just very, very awkward from Black's perspective, right? So that's why I instead recommend to move Bishop F5, which is the most precise move order. I mean, it means that, well, if they play Knight to E5, you can just play to move C6, and now this E6, Knight BD7, and challenging the Knight plan, it works a lot better when White has already played Knight E5, right? As opposed to Bishop D2, Bishop C4. There is a lot more theory to this. I remember there was actually a very recent game between Firouzja against Carlsen, actually, that Firouzja did manage to win as White against Carlsen in Chess 24 2021, though admittedly it was not 100% because of the opening, but because Carlsen misplayed the middle game later. It is something I do cover a lot more deeply in my course, of course. But in this game here between Svidler is white against Rapport, and, well, you may know that Svidler is a many-time Russian champion. I think 8-time Russian champion, maybe. I'm not sure if I'm remembering correctly, but he won it a lot of times, so I already lost count. So white went bishop c4, and now here we see the point of the move order. It's not to play c6 as we saw before, but instead to play e6. And then meet the move bishop d2, trying to annoy us with this discovery here. Well, we don't play c6, we play the move bishop b4. And the idea of bishop b4 is we're going for what's known as a light squared strategy. So that means that after the move a3, which is kind of the obvious move, right, to get the bishop pair advantage, and take queen to b6. And I mean, black is very solid here. You know, one of the main problems that might come up in the middle game of a Scandinavian if you misplay it is a move like d5. And I will say, to be fair, d5 is probably the best move and does give white a small advantage. But the position remains quite solid and very much playable for black. Again, as I show in my course, this video is in a way more of like an overview of the repertoire rather than going into a lot of details. But I do like to be completely upfront about what lines are the most annoying to deal with so that you are ready for them in case, you know, some very strong player prepares it. At least you know what's coming. But in the game, Svidler doesn't really find a way to set any kind of problems for Rapport whatsoever. In fact, I find it interesting that the move knight e5 has been played by quite a few GMs in recent games, because I just don't think it's a very good move. Actually, this happened in a game between Kayakin and Rapport. I believe this was an Armageddon game, if I remember correctly, where basically Rapport just played knight c6, and somehow Kayakin was just worse out of the opening. I won't show you the full game, but just to give you a brief idea, it was bishop to b3. If they play knight c6, we're actually going to kind of see that happen in the in our main game, actually, with that sort of sequence. But Kayakin thought that he could just play bishop b3 and just keep this knight here, saying that, okay, if you take on e5, I take, and I'm attacking your knight, and I've got bishops, I've got space. But what white is lacking here is coordination. And a theme that comes up quite a lot in this opening is just how passive this bishop pair is on c3 and b3. And Rapport took advantage of this in a game against Kayakin with rook fd8. And then from here, white realizes his position is so bad that, for example, queen f3, knight e4 is just clearly better for black, due to the fact that there are some very clear weaknesses in the white position, especially e5 and some of the queenside pawns, and even the bishop on b3 is vulnerable to an a5, a4 attack. So just very, very bad for white. Black can just take over the d file as well. It might look like white has an okay position, but if you play around with it a bit, you'll realize that white is actually struggling quite a lot. So this is why Kayakin went for this queen sack, but like, if you're sacking a queen, it's already clear that, you know, this is not really a very good outcome for the opening, and granted, Rapport ended up drawing this game in the end because he only needed a draw to get the full points with the Armageddon setting, because he had draw odds. But I would say that if it had been, let's say, a game where he had to win, he probably would have won it, because he was completely winning at some point, but decided, okay, I only need a draw, so let's just guarantee the draw rather than, you know, go for the win. So this was already a success story for Rapport in the Norway Chess Stavanger 2021 Super Tournament. You know, you may know that Kayakin was a world champion finalist, in fact, that he held Carlsen 6-6 in the World Championship 2016, and actually came close to winning that match. You know, he won the game 8 and took the lead in the match before eventually Carlsen beat him in the rapid tiebreak 3-1. But certainly of all the players to play Carlsen, he's kind of the closest to beating him in the World Championship match. So to beat such a player, or rather to get a winning position so quickly with black, in itself tells you just how dangerous his strongest Scandinavian is, even for strong players. So after castles here, well, there are two ways that you can play it. You can castle or you can play knight c6, but Rapport decides to castle. And here is where we get into the Svidler game, where white played b3, which, I mean, b3 is not a horrible move by any means. You know, try and go bishop b2, a4, and fix the problems with your inflexible structure on the queen side. But at the same time, you're not really fighting for a big advantage for this either. And now with the move of knight c6, well, Rapport is saying that, okay, if you play a4, you know, be my guest. I'll go knight b4, and I'll hit this weak c2 pawn. You have a5, but I go queen d6 and still like how you're defending the pawn. You know, if you do nothing, I can prepare a c5 break and say my structure is more flexible. You know, you can kind of see how this is not just an easy position for white to play. It's not like, oh, I have the bishops in space and I'm better. But okay, there are some problems with the structure and the piece harmony that have to be figured out, and which are not so easy to do in such. And if you are worried about a5, you can also just play a5 and then play knight b4, and I mean, that might even be a better way to play it. But anyway, the game saw knight to e5, and this was a mistake. And actually, it's a mistake I've come across quite a lot in games where I've played this against grandmasters, where they try to swap the pieces, but still their structure is quite bad. Now, actually, it would have been very interesting to play a move like knight e5 and rook fd8 in a similar spirit to what we saw in the Kayakin game before, but Rapport decided instead to play rook a8 and just to keep the pressure against the pawn on d4. After knight c6 and queen c6, it actually turns out that black is better at this point. And why is that? Well, the reason is that basically black's minor pieces are just better and just better coordinated than white's, and the white structure with d4, c2 is very much split. Now, to move bishop b2 is Svidler's attempt to at least mean that when black does play b5, that you're able to retreat the bishop and not have this bishop hanging. Computer thinks it's also very interesting to go e5 and just hit in the center, which is also a idea in these positions that, for example, c3, like, worst case you can take, go knight d5 and have a very comfortable position against the IQP. Computer says you don't even have to take, that you're better with some other moves like rook e8 or b5, but anyway, these are minor points. And in the game, black decided to go b5 and go for what I like to call the light squared strategy. Bishop d3 was played to make sure this pawn isn't simply taken, and after bishop takes, and knight to d5, we see that black has a very nice grip over the light squares, and that we essentially have a good knight versus a bad bishop. And if you turn the computer will say, yeah, it's nothing special, just rook fe1, the position is still equal, but still it's much easier to play black in such a position. And for example, you can go knight f4 and just make sure you never have any problems with white's extra space. Just go into an endgame, play knight b6 if you need to cover c4. Because if they do play c4, I mean, you could make an argument this pawn is kind of a weakness. And okay, it's not like you're winning by force or anything as black, but, you know, you are getting some opportunities to say that white is a bit overextended and that the space advantage is actually a disadvantage in this case. So it makes it quite a unique opening for black compared to many other defense to e4, where we take the opponent's space and use it against them. Good or good. Well, in the game, white played the move f3, and, you know, this is a little bit of a long game, but it's definitely worth going through in full. It's 69 moves in case you're wondering, so f3 is quite a clear mistake, though, because you're just weakening that king in the long term. And you don't have to really force it. Like, I know when I was starting to play this line in black in Blitz, one mistake I made is like, I know my position is better, but I can't prove it. Don't worry about proving it. Just play normal improving moves, build up the position, make sure a piece are all in good squares, and then make the break to make progress. So, Rapport played the move a6, which is kind of anticipating c4. Of course, you could also double up on the d file, but Rapport does this a little bit later. Granted, probably would have been better to do it immediately, but it doesn't drastically affect the trajectory of the game. Rook d7. Now I'd played c4, and c4 is actually a bit of a double-edged move at this point. Now, probably in hindsight, it's better to take and then play knight e7, just so that you're not potentially have a deal with an open c file, and you're also getting an open b file for the rook, which, well, we're going to beat white to the punch there, right? But after immediate knight e7, we still see this general issue for white, if you like, that the pawn on d4 is now a weakness because we can't defend it with c3 anymore. But if they did play c3 more earlier, then the bishop on b2 would be bad, so it's kind of a case of, you know, pick your poison. Probably white should play cb5 and a4 and, you know, try to open up the position for the bishop. Maybe try to get a passed pawn would be the right way to play for equality. By the way, this is the reason why it was better to play bc4 earlier, so white doesn't have that option to make the structure more asymmetrical, which typically favors the bishop, yes or yes. But instead, white played the move rook to c1 at this point. Black got out of the c file with queen to b7. Computer says queen b6 is better, but okay, this is blitz. The reason actually it's better is kind of a very deep tactical point that, you know, I think I can't really blame white for not seeing in a blitz game, but turns out d5 is sort of a really sensational idea that, you know, if you go ed5, there's bishop g7, like, completely crazy move, but the point is if you take, you run in a queen d4, and pretty much wherever the king goes, there's queen g4 next move, and you fork the king and the rook, so loose pieces drop off. But okay, to see this in a blitz game is very, very difficult, of course. And I think both players completely missed it, as the game instead saw rook e2, and then it's sort of back to business. And after bc4, computer instantly wants to go c6 and just build the pressure slowly, but the game saw bc4. And now, probably b takes c4 is the weaker recapture. I mean, I get that you don't want to play rook c4 and give a d5 outpost, but I think that this was the lesser evil. As after b takes c4, black now played the move of c5. And the idea is just to, isolate the c-pawn and put pressure on the center, and, it's not so easy for white to deal with. Again, the best bet for white is probably to go d5 and play it as a pawn sack, but also not the easiest decision to make in a blitz game with the clock ticking to just play a pawn down, as it were. Though it does turn out white does get compensation, but Svidler instead played the other move, queen to e4, and Rapport was quite happy to oblige and enter an endgame. Again, I would say cd4 maybe is an alternative, but black decided to play queen e4 instead. And still, this ending, is somewhat better for black. Rook b8 and the bishop is under fire. Probably with best play, white can hold it, but he's definitely a little bit under the pump, right? So rook c2 is a good defensive move, and after cd4, because Rapport didn't play it in the very best way, it does mean that this ending is quite close to being equal. But at the same time, this imbalance between a knight and a bishop that we get when we play bishop b4 and bishop c3, it gives us a lot of scope to outplay a weaker player, or potentially even a stronger player if we are more familiar with the position than they are, which, given that this line only started to become a thing in the last 9 or so years, is very, very likely. And, well, white didn't recognize that he has to play rook b2 and, try to trade off the rooks to equalize. And because normally speaking, when you've got the bishop versus the knight, you want to keep the rooks on the board if you have the bishop, yes or yes, because they generally coordinate better. But this position is kind of a rare exception, where somehow this bishop just doesn't have any real targets, because nearly all the black pawns are on the light squares. You could even play h5 if you wanted, just grab some space, but Rapport decided to go f6 and just prepare to improve the position of his king, as it were, which is also perfectly fine. Rook d2, and okay, now he decides to play the move rook d8. I would probably have gone knight e5 and tried to hit this guy. Maybe he was worried about rook d6, but apparently it's not that big a deal. Like after a5, for example. Kind of an important point here, actually, is that white isn't able to play rook e6 for tactical reasons. And again, I suppose, for Carlsen, Carlsen would probably find this in the game, but other players maybe not so likely. But the point is rook b1, king f2, and knight d3, forks the king and the bishop. It shows you just how tricky that knight is, especially in blitz. But Rapport didn't see that, and he played rook d8, and, normally speaking, this ending should, I think, just be a draw. But somehow Rapport was able to outplay his opponent later, so let's see how he did it. But Incheon is giving 0-0-0, just to be completely frank with you. So g4, g6 is played. So far, not a lot is really happening. Position is still very much balanced. But white is making some sort of micro inaccuracies that, okay, Incheon will still say it's a dead draw, but, you still can try to press a little bit if white is a little careless. So king d3, king e6, so the game is just going on, and, black is getting the king to c5. Another way to try and make progress is to try to maneuver the knight this way, but white's kind of got that covered for the moment. Like knight h4, you always got king e3, for example. So black decides to improve the position of his king first. Bishop c3, king c5, and okay, white's going bishop e1 to kick it back, so the king in turn goes back, king d6, and okay, we couldn't get in with the king, so let's try maneuvering the knight. Knight to d8, bishop to a7, I guess hoping for some cheapo like knight e6, bishop b8, which would be a little bit of an embarrassing skewer from behind. But black just goes king e6 to anticipate. Bishop b6, knight f7. And also notice that c5 wouldn't be a good move for white, because it just lets the king come in and fully blockade that pawn. White wants to keep the pawns on the light squares to complement his dark squared bishop nicely. White plays move h4, trying to avoid knight g5. h5 just fixes that pawn on the dark square, so it becomes more of a weakness, and that's this sort of technique, the Incheon isn't going to tell you this directly, because Incheon says 0-0-0 after every move that is, let's say, not putting a piece on pre. But still, it's these sort of principles of, fixing the opponent's pawns on the same color as the bishop. It's how you can outplay the opponent from these quote-unquote drawn positions. So knight c6, bishop f2, we have a bit more maneuvering going on. But after this, maybe Svidler sort of thought, well, maybe I can try to play for a win. Because that would be my only explanation, I guess, for why he, why I was thinking moves like king b4. But that being said, this is actually an actual idea, and your knight c6 does cover it. So after this, the knight maneuvers once again, we have back and forth, and yeah, normally speaking, a draw would just be agreed if this was a classical game, but, in blitz, anything can happen, and, well, anything did kind of happen, where we have a bit of shuffling, bishop b6, still not a great deal happening. But after knight to e4, because, e4 kind of just trades pawns, trading pawns generally helps the side that's defending, so knight e7 is trying to bring some pieces in, and here is where Svidler decides to go for the win, playing the move king to b4, and I think that There's kind of reason that Svidler lost the game. Like, if he just sat in a position with king d3, bishop f2, he would draw, because he has a fortress. But sometimes psychologically that's unpleasant to do. Like, even if you know you're holding, like, just to sit and just wait for your opponent to do stuff, it can be a bit of a difficult thing to do in an actual game, right? And so Svidler gets impatient and thinks, well, maybe I can just force a draw instantly. And okay, technically it is still just a draw, but now white has to be more precise. Like, you have to sort of play this move f takes e4, with the point that, if black does play f takes, well, now you go bishop c5. And then after, king e6 take, like, the ending is still a draw, but, like, white is the one who is obviously pushing for the win, with king f6 and okay, you can try to push the pawn or something. But a computer kind of confirms it ends up being a draw even here, which would, I guess, be the fair result of the game, as it were. Because if white goes c5, you got king f4, and, like, both sides queer at the same time, and I can try to grab a pawn, but the king is just too open, and it'll be a draw one way or the other. But Svidler messed up the move order with bishop c5 first, and you might wonder, well, what is the difference? Well, Rapport actually shows the difference here. He realized that you're not forced to play the move king e6 or king d7 to defend the knight, but actually you can play the move king to c6. And the point is that if white plays bishop takes e7, taking a knight, this is not what happened in the game, but to demonstrate the idea, ef3, the only way to stop f2 is bishop c5, but then the beautiful trick, pawn to a5, deflecting the king away from the bishop, and now the pawn queens and black just wins. So realizing he really screwed this up, Svidler played bishop f2, but it was too late. f3, and now this pawn is just going to run and just win. You're going to say, I'm so excited I can't draw arrows, but you get the idea. So game concluded to king c3, knight g6, king d4, trying to cover this, but knight f4 shows there's more than one path to Rome. And after king e3, knight to h3, well, we are able to force a winning pawn endgame. As in the case of king takes f3, we have take, and king c5. And yeah, it's obvious that black is a million times faster than white, or I guess if we are being really technical here, like if you play king f5, like if you count the race, yeah, you see that, black is one move faster, but very importantly, he's going to cover a1, h8 with the queen to make sure that white is not able to queen. And it's not a draw with the h pawn in this version. If the king is on g8, then yeah, it's a draw if you get there on the move. But we see that white is a move too slow, and after queen h8, it's just easy, right? So that's why I played bishop g3, hoping for some miracle, but after f4, then the miracle is not coming. Bishop f4, f2 is going to win a piece, as, well, actually even knight f4, in fact, just, the king is overloaded. And after king f3, fg3, king g3, the knight is not trapped. Well, okay, technically it's kind of trapped, but it's not really trapped, because here in this position, after black just plays to gain a little time on the clock, now he just plays the move king c5, and black is a million times faster. After king g1, king c4, king f2, king b3, it's obvious that black is winning this race by a country mile, and therefore Svidler resigned. Thank you, agree. This was a really fun game. I know I had a lot of fun sharing it with you. Rapport got a very nice advantage by about move 15 out of the opening, or actually move 17 to be precise. And granted, he did misplay it later on because it was blitz and position ended up just being equal, but even so, he was able to kind of use that knight versus bishop imbalance to keep the game going, and eventually Svidler fell for one of his tricks and Rapport was able to pull out the clutch win. So on that note, I hope that you guys enjoyed this video, and well, just to kind of summarize briefly, this was showing you how to play the strongest Scandinavian with queen takes t5, and is the strongest according to computer as well as a practical element. So to play queen a5, knight f6, and then to meet knight f6 with bishop f5, and, go for the bishop b4 idea that we saw in the game to get that bishop versus knight imbalance to play for a win, but to do so from a very solid foundation, right? So if you do want to really master these lines and, not just use what I showed here, but really become an expert as Scandinavian, and to be able to potentially outplay even grandmasters in these lines with black, then do make sure to check out my Play the Strongest Scandinavian course. I put a link in the description as a pinned comment for you to check out. And on that note, I will see you guys in the next training video. Do comment below also, like, what you enjoyed most of all about this game, because I love to hear about that. And I'll see you next time.